So I want you to imagine waking up tomorrow morning and, well, every technological, medical, and economic advancement your country has made since 1990 has just
Yeah,
vanished.
just completely wiped out.
Exactly. You walk outside and the infrastructure is visibly crumbling. You go to a hospital and it operates with the capabilities of the late 1980s.
If it's even operating at all.
Right. You check your bank account and your paycheck suddenly has half of its buying power. The local schools are emptying out before kids even reach the eighth grade.
It sounds like a movie.
It does. It sounds like the plot of some dystopian sci-fi novel. But, I mean, this is a mathematically documented reality. This is exactly what happens when the engine of human development shifts violently into reverse.
It's a terrifying thought experiment for you, the listener, to put yourself into. But for millions of people, it isn't an experiment.
No, it's not.
It is the raw, undeniable truth captured in the data we're looking at today. We are so conditioned to believe that human progress is like a ratchet
All
mechanism.
right, you pull it, it clicks forward, and it locks into place.
Exactly. But what we're examining today proves that the ratchet can and absolutely does shatter.
And that is exactly why we're here. You, the listener, have shared an incredibly striking, frankly, haunting set of materials with us today for this deep dive.
Yeah, it's definitely not our usual material.
Not at all. You've given us a meticulously designed 15-slide academic presentation. It's titled Time Flowing Backwards, a data-driven analysis of Syria's reverse development phenomenon and the fragility of human development.
That title alone is heavy.
Seriously. And backing up this presentation is a mountain-like, a massive raw spreadsheet mountain of United Nations data tables spanning from 1990 all the way to 2023.
We are going to be wading through an absolute alphabet soup of human metric data today.
Totally. But before we even look at a single number, we need to paint a picture of what this slide deck actually looks like.
Yeah, because the aesthetic choices here are, well, they're chillingly clinical.
I mean, there is zero fluff. None. If you're expecting corporate stock photos of people shaking hands or, colorful 3D pie charts.
You are in the wrong place.
Exactly.
Imagine pure white backgrounds. The hex code is literally F, 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 F. Just absolute blank white.
No decorative elements at all.
Right. No drop shadows, no gradients. The charts themselves are rendered in this very flat, deep, almost abyssal data blue.
And all the annotations, every arrow, every circle are done in this low saturation warning red.
It uses these flat red dashed circles and heavy text boxes to guide your eyes directly to the data anomalies.
It's a very brutalist academic style.
It is. And it does something very specific to the reader. It forces you to confront the data without any emotional or visual distraction. It strips away the rhetoric and leaves only the math.
But before we dive into that math, I need to stop and ask a fundamental question about the source material itself. Because, reading through these UN tables, I had a massive question mark flashing in my mind.
Oh, I think I know what you're going to ask.
We're talking about a nation undergoing a catastrophic systemic collapse, right? The state apparatus is fracturing. So how do we even have a UN spreadsheet?
That's a great question.
Like, who is walking around counting hospital beds or measuring carbon emissions in a blackout zone? If the infrastructure is dead, how is the data alive?
That speaks to the hidden science of data gathering in conflict zones. When a state's internal statistical agencies collapse, international bodies like the UN don't just throw their hands up.
They have to find another way.
Exactly. They switch from direct bureaucratic reporting to complex proxy indicators and remote sensing. For example, they use satellite imagery to measure nighttime luminosity.
Wait, like how bright the city lights are?
Yes, which is a highly accurate proxy for estimating GDP and power grid functionality. They also use geospatial analysis to track agricultural output.
So they are literally measuring the death of an economy from space.
They are. And for the human metrics, NGOs on the ground conduct rapid demographic health surveys using randomized cluster sampling in areas they can actually access.
And then they just use algorithms to fill the gaps.
Right. Algorithmic models estimate the rest. They track refugee outflows, cross-reference border data, and monitor mortality through remaining localized health clusters.
Wow.
So the data we're looking at isn't just a survey someone filled out. It is a forensic reconstruction of a society's collapse.
That makes the numbers feel even heavier, knowing the lengths required just to observe them. Which brings us to a hard ground rule we have to set for this deep dive.
Yes, this is absolutely mandatory.
Go ahead and lay it out.
I want to be crystal clear with you, the listener. We are looking at the catastrophic collapse of an entire nation's development metrics. triggered by severe, prolonged regional conflict. But we are taking absolutely no political sides today.
Zero.
We are not discussing the factions, the geopolitics, or the ideologies involved. Our goal today is strictly to interpret the statistical aftermath.
We're just looking at the math.
Exactly. We are treating the original source material purely as factual data to understand what it reveals about the vulnerability of human progress itself. We're acting purely as data forensic scientists today.
Right. We are looking at the structural integrity of modern society, nothing more. So let's look at the baseline. Because to understand how far something falls, you have to understand where it started.
And we naturally assume global development moves forward.
We do. And honestly, the UN data backs that up for the vast majority of the world. Between 1990 and 2023, the Global Human Development Index, the HDI, steadily, beautifully climbed.
It went from a score of 0.60 to 0.756.
Yeah, but we really need to pause and define what the HDI actually is, right? Because it's going to be the bedrock of our entire conversation.
Definitely. The Human Development Index was created to push back against the idea that GDP, just pure money, is the only way to measure a country's success.
Because money isn't everything if you're sick and uneducated.
Exactly. The HDI is a composite statistic. It triangulates a nation's well-being by combining three specific things: life expectancy at birth, education levels, and gross national income per capita.
So it's essentially calculating health, intellect, and wealth.
Precisely. So when we say the global HDI moved from 0.060 to 0.756 over those 3 decades, that is not just a statistical artifact.
It's real human lives improving.
It represents billions of people getting access to better medicine, child mortality plummeting, literacy rates skyrocketing. It represents the proliferation of the internet and modern supply chains.
It's a monumental triumph of global civilization. But the slide deck introduces a deeply unsettling counter-narrative right out of the gate.
Slide 1.
Yeah, the very first visual is this highly minimalist line graph. There are no specific axis numbers at first, just to build the suspense. You see this flat, gray, smooth line representing the period from 1990 to 2010.
Ticking upward, mirroring that global trend.
Exactly. The country is getting healthier, smarter, wealthier. And then the line suddenly turns into this thick, warning red color. And from 2011 to 2015, it just plunges off a cliff.
It is a visual representation of freefall. The angle of the line is what sociologists would call a demographic shock.
The second slide zooms in on the actual numbers, and this is where my jaw genuinely dropped. Their HDI peaked in 2010 at 0.669. By 2015, just 5 years later, it crashed to 0.549.
Which is a massive drop.
But the author places a heavy red dashed circle around the bottom of that drop to highlight a horrifying fact. That 2015 number doesn't just wipe out 5 years of growth.
No, it drops below their 1990 starting point.
Like below 0.572.
The sheer velocity of that regression is what makes this data set so terrifying. This isn't just a standard recession.
Like a recession is a temporary contraction.
Yeah. Even a lost decade of economic stagnation usually just means the line goes flat. But to fall backward, past the 25-year-old baseline, implies the literal erasure of a quarter century of societal gains.
It's the erasure of time, hence the title of the deck, Time Flowing Backwards. Let me test a metaphor on you to visualize how these three metrics, health, education, wealth, interact during a collapse like this.
Let's hear it.
People often compare national development to a house of cards, but I don't think that's accurate here. A house of cards just implies it's precarious. I think it's more like a biological ecosystem.
How so?
Well, think about a forest. The health of the soil, the canopy cover, the animal population, they're all interdependent. If you introduce a toxin that kills the soil, the canopy dies, which means the animals starve.
The systems rely on each other to survive.
Exactly. The HGI pillars are the same. If the health pillar snaps, the wealth pillar cannot bear the weight because sick people can't work. If the education pillar burns down, the health pillar eventually collapses because you stop producing new doctors.
It's a systemic, cascading organ failure. This is a much more accurate framework. And the UN data visualizes that exact systemic failure on the third slide.
Oh, the radar chart.
Yeah, sometimes called the spider web chart. It plots health, education, and income on different axes radiating from the center. In a healthy nation, that web expands outward evenly. Between 2010 and 2015, the polygon representing Syria doesn't just dip on one side. The entire web shrinks violently inward from all directions simultaneously.
Which means we need to deconstruct this collapse pillar by pillar. If we follow that inward collapse, the first thing we hit is health, visualized on slide 4.
The staircase chart.
Yeah, and it looks exactly like a staircase leading down into a dark basement. It tracks life expectancy. In 2010, the expected lifespan was a very respectable 73.54 years.
And by 2015,
It plummets to 63.26 years. That is an erasure of over 10 years of human life expectancy in a 5-year window.
and remember, during that exact same 5-year window, the global average life expectancy actually went up from roughly 70.6 to almost 72 years.
So the gap between this nation and the rest of the world is widening at both ends, but I want to push back on this data point just to understand the math.
Sure.
You provided the raw CSV files, and I dug into the gender breakdown. The male life expectancy crashed from over 71 years in 2010 down to an astonishing 57.1 years by 2015.
A drop of 14 years.
Right. Now, we've seen massive economic crashes in modern history. The 2008 global financial crisis, Greece's sovereign debt crisis. But we didn't see a drop in life expectancy of 14 years.
No, we didn't.
How does the math even account for a drop that massive in such a tiny window of time?
It's a critical distinction. It highlights the difference between an economic tightening and a systemic collapse. In a standard recession like 2008, people lose their homes, stress spikes, maybe preventative health care decreases.
Right. People can't afford copays.
Yeah, which might slowly shave a few tenths of a year off the national average over a decade. But a drop from 71 to 57 isn't about people skipping a cholesterol check.
It implies something actively lethal is happening at scale.
Exactly. First, you have the physical destruction of medical logistics. The hospitals aren't just underfunded, they are gone. Dialysis machines stop working because the grid fails. Insulin can't be refrigerated.
Clean water infrastructure breaks down.
Yes, leading to cholera and things that were previously eradicated.
Yeah.
So treatable conditions become fatal. But the biggest driver of that 14-year drop for men is massive, non-natural mortality.
Meaning casualties of the conflict itself.
Right. The sheer volume of young men dying severely skews the average downward. If an 80-year-old dies at 70, that moves the needle slightly. But if tens of thousands of 20-year-olds die, it mathematically drags the expected lifespan off a cliff.
It is a demographic canyon. That makes the math tragically clear. And it connects directly to the second pillar, wealth.
Slide 6.
Right. The presentation skips to slide 6 for this, and the visual is brutal. It's a bar chart showing gross national income, or GNI, and the tops of the bars form this steep downward curve.
The text box notes that wealth simply evaporated. GNI shrank by 52%.
And the raw data specifies that purchasing power parity PPP plunged from over $8,200 per capita to under $4,000. We really need to unpack PPC, though.
We do, because it's the only way to understand what a 52% drop feels like to a human being. GNI alone can be misleading if a country has hyperinflation.
Like, if everyone has $1 million, but bread costs $2 million.
Exactly. The GNI looks high, but people are starving. Purchasing power parity measures actual buying power by comparing the cost of a standard basket of goods.
So it asks, how much actual physical food, fuel, medicine can your income buy you?
Right. When PPP drops from $8,200 to under $4,000, it means the fundamental cost of survival has outpaced income to a catastrophic degree.
If my purchasing power gets cut in half tomorrow, I'm not just canceling my streaming services. I'm deciding between electricity and dinner protein.
You're rationing your children's food. And at a macro level, it signals the death of the formal economy. Complex industries die. Manufacturing stops.
The service economy evaporates.
Because no one has discretionary income. What replaces it is a survival economy.
Yeah.
Barter systems. Informal labor. It is a complete regression of economic complexity.
Okay, so health and wealth, those measure the immediate visceral pain of right now. If your hospitals are gone and your wallet is empty, you are suffering today.
But what about tomorrow?
Exactly, because if the formal economy is dead, what are the kids doing? That brings us to education, the third pillar.
Visualized on slide 5.
With a dumbbell chart, it looks like two weights on a barbell. The left weight represents 2010. Expected years of schooling was 11.9 years, meaning a child could reasonably expect to almost finish high school.
But the right weight on the barbell, representing 2023, sits at just 7.41 years.
Let's translate that into human reality. That means the average child is forced out of the educational system before they reach high school.
They're leaving at 12 or 13 years old.
And they aren't just sitting at home playing video games. The economy has collapsed. I have to deduce these 12-year-olds are being pushed directly into that survival economy you mentioned.
Absolutely. They are scavenging, working manual labor, or being swept up into the conflict. The opportunity cost of sitting in a classroom is too high for a starving family.
But the slide points to an even deeper consequence. There's a red dashed circle highlighting that 7.41 figure with a note. Educational interruption hinders long-term recovery.
That's the structural void.
Right, because if kids drop out in 7th grade, you're losing the future architects of your society. You don't get college students, so you don't get new structural engineers.
Or surgeons, or civil planners.
So 10 years down the line, who actually rebuilds the nation?
This is the mathematical definition of the lost generation. This isn't a temporary dip in test scores. It is a permanent hollowing out of the nation's human capital.
A void that will echo for 50 years.
Precisely. If you miss high school today, you don't magically become an electrical engineer a decade from now. You can import concrete to rebuild a bridge, but you can't import a generation of homegrown professionals.
You have to grow them, and that takes 20 years.
And that creates a vicious cycle. Without educated professionals, you can't rebuild the economy. Without an economy, you can't fund the schools. The 7.41 metric is a lock on the door to the future.
Wow, so we have a shrinking economy, dying healthcare, and bleeding schools. But there's a dark secondary effect to this contraction.
The inequality metrics.
Right. When a national pie shrinks by 50%, the remaining slices are never divided equally. When systems collapse, the data shows exactly who gets pushed out first.
The UN tracks this using the inequality-adjusted HDI, or IHDI.
Let's break that down. How does IHDI differ from regular HDI?
Regular HDI is an average. If you have 1 billionaire and 9 people starving, the average wealth looks okay. IHDI adjusts that score downward based on how unequally resources are distributed.
So the greater the inequality, the further the IHDI falls below the HDI.
Exactly.
And slide 7 visualizes this with a lollipop chart. You have the overall HDI, which is terribly low, but the IHDI plummets even further to 0.419 in 2015. The chart shows this massive dark gray gap.
Representing development loss due to inequality.
I think of it like the lifeboats on a sinking ship. When resources vanish, pre-existing societal biases dictate who gets a seat in the lifeboat.
The vulnerability of marginalized groups is vastly amplified by the panic of scarcity.
And that becomes undeniable when you look at gender disparities on slides 8 and 9, the Gender Development Index, the GDI.
Slide 8 uses a waffle chart to compare GNI by gender in 2023.
And the visual disparity is shocking. Female GNI is an average of $11,148 versus $6,087 for men.
The men have roughly 6 times the purchasing power, and the labor force participation rate is worse. For women, it's 14.67% compared to men at 69.79%.
Let me put that in context, because the global average for female labor force participation is around 46%, so 14.67% is an extreme outlier.
And slide 12 adds that only 24.05% of women over 25 have some secondary education, compared to a global average of 62%.
So what is the mechanism here? Are women just being fired from their jobs during a crisis?
It's much deeper. When a society collapses, formal safety nets vanish, daycares close, elder care shuts down, schools empty out.
The healthcare system can't support the sick or wounded.
Right, so all that care requirement gets pushed back into the private home. And due to entrenched norms, the burden of that intensive unpaid care work falls almost entirely on women.
You can't work a formal job if you're caring for injured relatives 16 hours a day.
Exactly. The collapse acts as a vacuum that sucks women out of the workforce. And there's a physical security element, too.
Right. If the streets aren't safe, mobility is restricted.
Families restrict the movement of women and girls as a protective measure, locking them further out of the formal economy.
And the macro tragedy is that this secretly acts as an invisible wall against economic recovery. How can you rebuild when 85% of your female population is locked out of the workforce?
You're trying to rebuild with one hand tied behind your back. It's mathematically impossible.
Which brings us to a highly counterintuitive part of the tracking. Sometimes a number looks incredibly positive at first glance, but the why reveals a darker story.
Oh, the planetary pressures adjusted HDI, or PHDI. Slide 11.
My favorite part of the deck. The PHDI adjusts a score based on carbon dioxide emissions. The goal is to reward sustainable growth, right?
Right.
So the chart shows carbon emissions absolutely plummeting. They halved, dropped from 2.76 tons in 2010 to 1.09 in 2023. A climate activist skimming this might think, wow, they smashed their climate goals.
But the author marks this massive drop with a giant graphic. It's the pseudo-green anomaly.
Because the emissions didn't drop due to green policy. The energy grid didn't get cleaner, it just ceased to
The
exist.
factories were bombed into rubble, the supply chains seized up, the daily commute vanished because there were no jobs.
This is forced deindustrialization.
Exactly. The carbon jumped simply because the modern economy died. It's an illusion of progress built on top of a graveyard.
It proved ecological metrics can't be divorced from human prosperity. So if the carbon drop is a mirage, we have to look for a metric that cannot be faked. A lie detector.
Slide 10, maternal mortality.
The maternal mortality ratio, or MMR. The visual is a U-shaped curve. From 1990 to 2010, the curve drops beautifully. 43 deaths down to 21.29. That's the 25-year buildup.
But then it hits the bottom, reverses, and rebounds sharply upward, hitting 33.04 by 2019.
Why maternal mortality specifically? Why is this the metric that proves infrastructure has crumbled?
Because treating chronic diseases can be variable. But safely delivering a child during an emergency complication like hemorrhage requires an immediate, massive, synchronized web of infrastructure.
An acute event that requires all systems to be go.
Exactly. You need safe roads and ambulances to get to the hospital. You need a sterile hospital, which means constant, clean, running water.
You need highly reliable electricity for surgical lights and monitors.
You need the human capital surgeons, nurses on call 24/7. And crucially, a stable blood bank, which absolutely requires an unbroken cold chain refrigeration system.
So when maternal mortality spikes from 21 to 33, it's mathematical proof that the roads, the grid, the water, the supply chain, and the education system have all simultaneously snapped.
You cannot fake maternal survival rates.
It is the clearest metric of profound structural decay. So we've looked at this internal breakdown. Where does this leave the nation relative to the rest of the planet?
Slide 13 uses a downward staircase to show the global HDI ranking. In 2010, they ranked 123rd, middle of pack. By 2023, it has fallen to 171st.
Dropped into the lowest possible tier. But slide 14 is the one that really terrifies me. The most alarming visual of the whole deck.
The L-shaped stagnation curve.
Yeah. We saw the line drop violently to 2015. But after hitting bottom, it doesn't bounce back. It goes completely flat. For 8 straight years, the HDI just hovers around 0.564.
It is the nightmare scenario for economists.
Because basic economic theory teaches us elasticity. You have a recession, capital flows back in, you get a V-shaped recovery. Or maybe a U-shaped recovery. But an L-shape means the elasticity is gone.
I explain it using engine compression. A standard recession is a car running out of gas. You pour fuel back in, turn the key, it starts, V-shape.
Okay, so the L-shape.
An L-shaped collapse is the engine block itself cracking. You can pour all the foreign aid into the tank you want, but there's no structural compression left in the cylinders. The internal mechanics are broken.
And those mechanics are the 3 pillars.
Exactly. You can't generate a bounce. You need workers, but life expectancy plummeted. You need engineers, but kids left school in 7th grade. You need a labor force, but women are locked in unpaid care work.
The internal battery is drained. They cannot generate their own momentum.
So without massive, sustained external intervention, they're just stuck.
Stuck at the bottom of the L. And the tragic part is the rest of the world isn't standing still. The global average is still ticking upward.
So you're actively becoming more isolated and marginalized every day.
The gap grows wider by the hour. This has been an incredibly heavy dive. Analyzing the raw math of societal collapse isn't easy, but it's vital.
Slide 15 distills everything into 3 main takeaways we need to sit with.
Let's walk through them. First is the extreme fragility of modern development. A quarter century of progress can be erased in 5 years. We think civilization is reinforced concrete, but it can revert to dust quickly.
The second is the devastating long-term impact of a lost generation. When education is interrupted, you fracture human capital for a half-century. The L-shape isn't just a lack of money, it's a lack of prepared minds.
And the third takeaway is the stark reality of edge nations being left behind. Global macro averages show humanity marching forward, but those averages mask the profound isolated pain of societies in freefall.
We have to be willing to look at granular data without the noise of politics because the raw numbers show us exactly where the floor has fallen out.
We started this deep dive talking about the comforting assumption of a ratchet of progress that only clicks forward. We've spent the last hour looking at what it looks like when that ratchet shatters.
25 years erased in 5.
So, as you go out the rest of your day, look around. Look at the local schools, the hospital with its refrigerated blood banks, the paved roads, the invisible web of your local economy. And ask yourself, how deep are the roots of your own society's progress? What are the invisible forces keeping that line moving upward? instead of plunging down.